The wind screamed across the barbed wire fence of Stalag Luft III as snow fell in thin, bitter sheets. Beneath the gray German sky, a line of American prisoners shuffled toward roll call, boots crunching through frozen mud. Among them stood a man whose presence seemed to freeze the guards mid-step, not because of defiance but because of the words that slipped from his mouth. "Morgen, Herr Feldwebel," he said fluently, his voice steady, accent perfect. The German sergeant stopped dead. A black American POW, thin from weeks of starvation, speaking flawless German as if he were born in Berlin. The silence that followed was electric, confusion and disbelief colliding like thunder. The guards looked at one another, and for the first time they hesitated. The guards never forgot that morning, and neither did the prisoners. Word spread through the frozen compound faster than any rumor before it. Some of the black POWs could speak German, not broken, not basic, but fluent. That fact alone shattered one of the most deeply rooted Nazi beliefs, that these men were ignorant, inferior, incapable of intellect. The Reich had built an empire on lies, but in Stalag Luft III in the dead of winter, reality stepped forward wearing a torn American uniform and frostbitten boots. Inside Barracks 13, the stove barely warmed the stale air. Frost crawled along the wooden ceiling beams and breath misted like smoke with every word spoken. Private Langston King, born in Harlem, raised on German philosophy and classical literature his father taught at Columbia, sat at a crude wooden table with a tin cup of half-frozen coffee. Opposite him were 3 black POWs of the Tuskegee Airmen, downed pilots and crewmen still defiant despite the hunger hollowing their faces. King spoke softly, almost academically, yet every word carried weight. "They think we don't understand how they talk, how they think, what they fear. They're wrong." The men around him nodded. They were exhausted, wounded, and cold, but something had shifted. The guards had flinched that morning, not from violence, but from language. Knowledge had rattled them more than fists ever could. Their imprisonment had begun months earlier, when their B-24 Liberator, shot to pieces during a bombing run, went down over Saxony. After parachuting into a field, they were beaten by local civilians, turned over to the Wehrmacht, and transported like cattle to the camp. The German officers expected broken men. Instead, they found educated soldiers who could speak their tongue, read their signs, and decipher the curses hurled at them. For the first weeks, King kept his fluency hidden. Listening was more valuable than being heard. From the guards' conversations, he learned when supply trains were delayed, when rations would be cut, when punishments were coming. The Germans spoke freely around prisoners they believed illiterate. But the day he spoke aloud to the Feldwebel during roll call, the instant the guards realized one of the men could understand them, everything changed. That evening, the Germans pulled him from the barracks. Snow lashed the yard as they marched him across the compound toward the interrogation hut, a small wooden structure lit only by a single lantern swaying in the wind. 2 guards stood outside, rifles slung across their chests. Inside, smoke curled from a cheap cigarette clenched between the teeth of an SS Oberleutnant, a thin man with a skull's face and eyes like cold steel. He didn't bother speaking English. "Wo haben Sie Deutsch gelernt?" "Where did you learn German?" King sat straight-backed, shivering but unbroken. "New York, mein Vater war Professor." "New York, my father was a professor." The officer blinked, thrown off balance. This wasn't how their propaganda described African Americans. They were supposed to be uneducated, simple laborers, not men quoting Goethe and speaking with precise grammar. The interrogation lasted hours. The Germans asked if the United States was training black soldiers as spies. King smiled, knowing full well the idea terrified them. He answered calmly, offering nothing useful, but every perfect sentence undermined the racial lies Germany fed its people. By dawn, the SS officer dismissed him, not because he believed King harmless, but because he didn't know what to do with a man who was never supposed to exist. When King returned to the barracks, the prisoners gathered around him. They expected bruises, beatings, humiliation. Instead, he returned untouched, cold, pale, but standing tall. And with him, he carried something more important than food or medicine: information. "They're moving 40 prisoners tomorrow," he whispered, voice almost too low to hear. "Sick men. They won't survive the transport." The guards had assumed he couldn't understand. They were wrong. At dusk, King and the Tuskegee men visited the infirmary. officially to deliver blankets, unofficially to warn the ill. They whispered in German near the guards, testing reactions, watching the flicker of uncertainty cross their faces. Some guards gave orders more quietly now, afraid their words might be understood. Fear was creeping into the camp, not of violence but of intelligence. The Germans had never imagined they were being watched from inside their own language. Within the camp, some white American prisoners had held the same prejudices the Germans did. Before capture, many had refused to believe black servicemen could fly bombers or navigate missions. Yet in captivity, stripped of rank and status, reality was unavoidable. The Tuskegee Airmen carried themselves with a pride that hadn't broken under imprisonment. Their fluency in German, their discipline, even their sense of humor, on the worst days, forced men to confront the lies they had grown up with. One night, during roll call, a guard shouted orders. Impatient, angry, convinced no one understood him, King stepped forward, translating the command perfectly. The guard froze. The prisoner stared. And then, slowly, one white pilot at the end of the line repeated the German words himself, badly but loudly. A second joined. Then a third. The guard's face flushed with panic as more voices spoke the language he thought protected him. By morning, the entire camp was talking about the Amerikaner mit zwei Sprachen, the bilingual Americans. It infuriated some guards. Others became cautious. A few even became human. One elderly guard, once a schoolteacher before the war swallowed him whole, approached King in secret one night near the fence. His hands shook as he offered a small crust of bread. Ihr Deutsch ist besser als das meiner Schüler, he murmured. Your German is better than my students. King accepted the bread with dignity, thanking him quietly, and in that fragile moment, the war became something smaller. Two men, tired and hungry, choosing respect where cruelty was easier. Still, the danger grew. The SS wanted answers. How many of the black POWs understood German? Who taught them? Were there more? Rumors spread through the guard ranks like infection. Some feared the prisoners were planning escape. Others feared something worse, that these men were proof Germany's racial doctrine was a lie. The weather hardened with each passing week. Food dwindled. Disease spread. But the prisoners saw something they had not seen in months. Uncertainty in their captors' eyes. When guards shouted insults, the prisoners smiled knowingly. When officers whispered orders, they spoke more softly, suddenly aware of ears they once assumed deaf. And among the prisoners, dignity began to return. Slow, fragile, but real. The Tuskegee men, despite starvation and humiliation, held their heads higher. Knowledge had become a weapon no rifle could match. But word came that the Germans were planning a transfer to a labor camp deeper in the Reich, one with a reputation so dark no one returned. The guards assumed the prisoners couldn't understand the paperwork, the orders, the destination. But King read every word. He wasn't going to let them vanish quietly. The announcement came before sunrise, delivered in clipped, hurried German. A transport was arriving in 2 days. 40 prisoners, sick, wounded, malnourished, would be moved. The guard said it was to a medical facility. Every man in the camp knew that was a lie. The destination was a labor camp rumored to experiment on prisoners, a place with no Red Cross parcels, no warmth, no return. King gathered the men in Barracks 13 under cover of the storm outside. Snow beat against the windows, howling across the frozen yard. The stove glowed weakly, barely touching the cold that crept into bone. The Tuskegee Airmen surrounded him, Lieutenant Harris with a bandaged leg, Sergeant Coleman coughing into a rag spotted with blood, Corporal Jennings missing 2 fingers after frostbite claimed them. They were exhausted, but their eyes burned with a final ember of defiance. They think we don't know, King said quietly. They think we're blind. Even speaking the words risked punishment, but the men leaned closer. We're not going to let them take our sick, Harris whispered. Not without a fight. It wasn't bravado. It was desperation sharpened into purpose. Days earlier, King had overheard a conversation between the SS officer and the camp commandant. Plans, dates, guards assigned to the transport detail. He remembered every word. The prisoners were too weak to mount a revolt, too unarmed to fight back with force. But they had something else. Information, timing, the element of surprise. Escape from a POW camp was nearly impossible in winter. Escape with wounded men was suicide. But the Russians were advancing from the east, artillery rumbling closer every week. Sooner or later, the Germans would abandon the camp. The sick just needed to stay long enough to be liberated. If they could delay the transport, disrupt orders, confuse schedules, sabotage communication, they might survive. The plan began with language. The guards depended on written orders. King could read every sheet posted at the command hut. That night, wrapped in stolen blankets, he and Harris slipped through the shadows toward the administrative building. The snow muffled their steps. The guard on duty leaned against the wall, nearly asleep from the cold. Through a cracked window, the prisoners saw a stack of documents, transfer manifests, guard rotations, logistics for the trucks. They didn't steal the papers. That would cause suspicion. Instead, King slid a sliver of ice under the window frame, slowly lifting the latch until the pane unlocked. With gloved fingers trembling, he reached inside and turned the pages just enough to smear the wet ink. Names blurred. Dates dissolved into black streaks. Orders became illegible. By dawn, the commandant was cursing at clerks frantically rewriting documents from memory. Time was lost. Hours became days if the confusion spread. The prisoners waited for retaliation, but none came. The guards assumed moisture from the storm ruined the orders. No one imagined a POW could read, let alone sabotage. The next step was riskier. The transport trucks required fuel stored in a locked shed. Coleman, limping but determined, led a small group of men across the yard, crawling under searchlights that swung in slow, hypnotic arcs. The lock was old, rusted, its metal brittle in the cold. They broke it silently with a stone wrapped in cloth. Inside, fuel drums lined the walls. They didn't destroy them. Instead, they loosened valves just enough for gasoline to seep slowly into the snow. By morning, the guards found half the supply drained, frozen into a slick sheet across the ground. The trucks couldn't drive without it. New fuel had to be brought from a nearby depot, delaying the transfer further. Inside the barracks, the prisoners listened for alarms, for boots rushing toward them, for German screams of discovery. None came. The guards blamed weather again. They blamed equipment failure. But beneath the icy calm, frustration grew. The captain of the guard paced the parade ground, barking orders so loudly his words echoed across the camp. King listened from the barracks, translating every furious sentence for the men. 2 days, he whispered. We bought 2 days. 2 days was life. Night after night, the rumor spread. The black Americans are doing something. At first it sounded like myth. Men thought hunger was driving them mad, but then the sick were not moved. The trucks did not start. The guards grew anxious, and in their anxiety they made mistakes. On the 6th night, an argument broke out near the eastern tower. A young German guard shouted at a sergeant, accusing him of losing paperwork. The older man slapped him across the face, screaming that Americans were stupid savages, incapable of such sabotage. The prisoners watching from barracks windows smiled thinly. Every word overheard by King strengthened their resolve, yet the danger sharpened. The SS officer returned, furious. He interrogated prisoners again and again. He dragged men into the snow and demanded names. King watched men beaten until blood stained the ice, but not one spoke. They weren't silent out of fear, they were silent out of pride. The SS wanted a traitor to blame. When none appeared, they blamed each other. Still, the prisoners knew the Germans wouldn't fail forever. The trucks would be repaired. Fuel would arrive. New orders would be written. And so, on a night colder than any before, King made a final decision. He gathered the Tuskegee men and the sickest prisoners in the barracks. We may have one chance left, he said. If the guards believe the Russians are close enough, they'll flee the camp. They won't waste time with a transport. How do we make them believe that? A dying pilot whispered. King looked to Lieutenant Harris. Harris spoke German too, not as fluently but enough. You heard the guards, Harris said. They know the Russians are advancing. Gunfire carries on cold air. The men understood. If they could imitate artillery, explosions, gunshots, tank engines, they could trigger panic. The guards were half-starved, freezing, and terrified of being overrun. The idea wasn't insane. It was brilliant. The prisoners ripped bed slats into planks. They packed snow into old metal tins, freezing it into solid weight. At night, under cover of darkness, they crept near the outer fence and hurled the makeshift shells into the frozen forest beyond the camp. The heavy thud sounded like distant artillery. Some struck trees, cracking branches like gunshots. Others smashed into ice, echoing across the silent night like mortar fire. The guards jumped from their posts, shouting in fear. 2 fled their towers, abandoning rifles behind them. Sirens never sounded. The camp had none. But panic spread faster than orders could contain it. The next night they repeated the bombardment. Louder, closer, more coordinated. The Germans believed the Red Army was almost upon them. Some guards packed their belongings. Others begged the commandant to evacuate. King had turned language into a weapon and fear into an ally. By morning, the transfer was postponed indefinitely. The sick remained in their bunks, saved not by force but by intelligence the enemy never expected. The storm that had cloaked their nights of sabotage finally broke. By the 7th morning, sunlight cut through the clouds in sharp, pale rays that glinted off the barbed wire. It should have brought warmth, relief, anything but dread. Instead, the prisoners woke to a new sight: reinforcements. Trucks rumbled into the yard, engines coughing plumes of black smoke, carrying fresh guards in gray overcoats with red SS armbands. The old half-frozen sentries were dismissed. The newcomers stood taller, eyes colder, rifles clean and ready. The uneasy balance the sabotage had created was broken in a heartbeat. The camp would not be abandoned. The sick would not be spared. Every man in Barracks 13 understood it instantly. The first order of the new SS captain was brutal. Prisoners were dragged from bunks and lined against the snow. Harris whispered, "No more confusion." They came to send a message, and they did. Any man who resisted was beaten. Any man too slow to stand was struck with rifle butts. The captain stared at the Tuskegee prisoners like they were animals in a cage. He walked to King and stopped inches away, eyes narrowing. "You speak German," he said quietly, too quietly. It wasn't a question. Somehow he knew. For the first time, King felt fear coil tight in his stomach. The captain ordered the strongest men to dig a trench outside the wire. The weaker ones watched through frost-rimmed windows as their comrades swung shovels into frozen earth. Rumors spread fast. A trench could mean anything: latrines, drainage, graves. The prisoners whispered the last possibility with trembling voices. If the SS had discovered the sabotage, if they wanted to set an example, the execution of a few could terrify the many. A single gunshot in a camp this silent would echo for miles. King knew the men were looking to him, waiting for a signal, a plan. But there was nothing left to sabotage, no more tricks to buy time. The new guards were disciplined, unwavering, sober. They weren't fooled by shadows or noises in the trees. Every step of every prisoner was watched. It would have ended there if not for a small, unexpected moment of mercy. Near dusk, while guards escorted prisoners back inside, a German medic slipped a piece of bread to Sergeant Coleman. It was quick, almost invisible, but King saw it. Hours later, when the barracks fell quiet, the medic returned. He spoke softly through a crack in the wall. "Russians took Breslau," he whispered. "They are closing in." The words trembled with fear. He wasn't warning the prisoners out of kindness. He was warning them because he knew if the SS decided to retreat, the POWs might be killed to erase evidence of mistreatment. The meaning was clear. The camp was reaching a breaking point. That night, King gathered his men. "There's one thing left," he said. "One risk." His voice was steady, but his hands shook with exhaustion. "If they know we understand them, if they know we can explain to the Russians what happened here, they won't kill us. We need witnesses. The SS fear witnesses more than they fear prisoners." Harris stared at him. "You want to talk to them?" "Yes," King said. "Not secretly, publicly, so the whole camp sees it." It was insane. Speaking German openly would expose him. But exposure might be protection. If the guards realized they were dealing with educated soldiers, not the racist caricatures Nazi propaganda promised, they might hesitate. Even fanaticism could be tempered by self-preservation. Morning came with a crack of ice as prisoners lined up again. The SS captain inspected them one by one, boots sinking into snow. When he reached King, the yard fell silent. Snowflakes drifted slowly, hanging in the winter air like suspended breath. King lifted his chin. "We know the Russians are close," he said loudly, clearly, in perfect German. Gasps shot through the ranks. Guards whipped their heads toward him. The captain froze, stunned. For a moment, no one moved. King's voice carried across the yard, echoing off barracks. "If anything happens to us, the Russians will know. The Americans will know. You will answer for it. It wasn't a threat. It was a statement of fact. Some guards looked uneasy, young men who had been promised an easy war. Others looked enraged. The captain's face reddened, lips pressed into a thin, hateful line. He grabbed King by the coat and slammed him against a post. "Silence," he hissed. But King did not look away. Even bruised, he held the captain's gaze without blinking. It was the first time many prisoners had ever seen a black man stare down an SS officer and refuse to flinch. That moment changed the camp, not because the guards suddenly respected him, they didn't, but because fear shifted. The SS had believed the prisoners ignorant, helpless, unable to communicate. Now they knew King could speak to Russians, to Germans, to anyone. He represented a link to the outside world. Killing him would create questions. Leaving him alive meant uncertainty. The captain shoved him away and barked for the prisoners to be locked inside. But the message had landed. Inside Barracks 13, the men looked at King in awe. Someone whispered, "You put fear in them." He didn't feel fearless. His ribs ached from the blow. His throat stung with cold air. But in that pain was something powerful, possibility. The guard's hesitation had been real. The next 24 hours were a frozen eternity. No one slept. Every creak of boots outside stirred panic. But dawn brought something unexpected. The sound of engines sputtering to life, not in hostility, but in retreat. Trucks loaded with supply crates drove out of the camp. Guards burned paperwork in metal barrels, flames licking up toward the pale sky. The captain shouted orders not to shoot prisoners, just to watch them. Watch them. Guard them. But not kill. The Russians were too close. On the second night, artillery thundered faintly in the distance. Not the improvised kind. Real gunfire, real war. The ground shook beneath the barracks. Guards abandoned their towers. Some ran, some hid. Some stayed, trembling with rifles clutched to their chests. Then, as if the war itself tore open the sky, a distant roar filled the air. Tanks. The prisoners pressed to the windows, breath fogging the glass. Snow whipped across the yard as dark shapes approached from the tree line. German guards dropped weapons, hands raised. Others simply fled through the woods. King staggered to the door, heart pounding. The Tuskegee airmen supported him on both sides. When the tanks burst through the final drift of snow, red stars painted across their armor, the prisoners understood. They had lived long enough. The gates fell. Russian soldiers stormed the camp, shouting orders, tossing blankets, carrying men from the barracks. King felt the icy air hit his face as he limped into the open for the first time as a free man. The guards who mocked him, who doubted him, who never believed a black American could speak their language, lay face down in the snow, stripped of power. King exhaled, and for the first time in months the breath did not turn to fear. The Russians did not linger. Liberation was chaos, shouted orders, men wrapped in blankets, medics moving fast, trucks pulling away with the weakest prisoners first. King was placed on a wooden sled dragged toward a column of vehicles, but he pushed himself upright, insisting he could walk. His legs shook from starvation, but pride held him steady. As they crossed the gate, he looked back at the camp, the guard towers half abandoned, the barbed wire glittering with frost. The place that had tried to erase him now stood as proof he had survived it. Snow fell harder, swallowing footprints almost as fast as they formed. The column moved west toward Allied lines, escorted by Russian tanks, treads grinding through frozen earth. Prisoners huddled on flatbeds wrapped in Soviet coats that smelled of smoke and oil. Russian soldiers handed out bread and cigarettes with rough kindness, unsure how to speak to these thin Americans with haunted eyes. When a young Russian gunner heard King's German, he blinked in surprise. When he heard King's English, he broke into a wide grin and slapped him on the back. It was the first friendly touch King had felt in months, but the road to safety was not gentle. Villages lay in ruins, rooftops caved in from artillery, windows shattered, barns burned to black skeletons. Livestock wandered loose, half-starved, nosing at snow for scraps of grass. Civilians stepped from ruins to stare at the column, faces hollow, wrapped in blankets, clutching children with blue fingers. War had crushed everyone, not just soldiers. The prisoners stared back, realizing freedom also meant witnessing how much of the world had bled for it. At night, they camped in barns and deserted houses. Russian soldiers shared thin soup and black bread. King slept on hay that scratched his skin but felt like heaven compared to wooden bunks. One night, a Russian officer entered the barn and addressed the prisoners in German. Many stared blankly, but King translated every word. The officer's eyebrows shot up. In minutes, King was outside, sitting by a fire, speaking German and broken Russian with two officers who wanted every detail of the camp: numbers, guards, weapons, treatment. His voice shook, but he told them everything. The officers took notes. Witnesses mattered. King was becoming a witness. By the third day, Allied forces were near. American recon units swept the road, and when the first olive-drab jeeps rolled into view, the prisoners erupted in cheers so loud the Russian drivers laughed. The jeep screeched to a stop. An American MP jumped out, eyes wide in disbelief. "What the hell, Tuskegee?" he said, staring at the gaunt men in shredded coats. When King nodded, the MP swallowed hard. "We've been looking for you since December." Trucks transported them to a field hospital set up in a German town seized days earlier. Nurses and doctors rushed forward. White coats, warm blankets, steaming water, clean sheets. Men who had been beaten, starved, frozen, and humiliated were finally treated like human beings. When King removed his shirt, a doctor counted ribs with trembling fingers. "You should be dead," he whispered. King managed a weak smile. "I tried not to be." For days they slept, ate, and healed. Some regained strength quickly, others slowly. The Red Cross recorded their names. Letters were written home, shaky handwriting on clean paper. Some found out parents had died. Others discovered wives had remarried. War cost more than blood. It cost time, futures, pieces of souls. But every man in Barracks 13 still breathed, and that alone made them lucky. One morning, a stern colonel walked into the ward, clipboard in hand. He looked at the Tuskegee survivors with a mixture of awe and sadness. "We have reports," he said. "Russian officers say one of you negotiated with SS guards in German during the final days." All eyes turned to King. The colonel stepped forward. "Son, how did you learn the language?" King's voice was rough. "My mother taught it to me. She was a translator before the Depression." The colonel nodded slowly, a small smile forming. "Well, you saved lives with those words." But the military was not prepared for what came next. The surviving men were flown to France, then shipped to the United States for debriefing. At Camp Lucky Strike, a repatriation camp near Le Havre, American journalists arrived by the dozen. Cameras clicked, questions flew, but when reporters noticed several prisoners were black Tuskegee airmen, confusion rippled through the crowd. Many Americans didn't know black pilots even existed. Fewer knew black ground crews, medics, and logistics units had fought across Europe. Now these men stood in front of them, uniforms threadbare, bodies thin, but eyes sharp as steel. A reporter asked, "Did the Germans treat you differently because of your race?" King answered without hesitation. "They didn't see race. They saw Americans, and we survived." That line hit papers across the Atlantic. Congressmen read it. Generals read it. Black families read it with tears in their eyes. Racism had chased these men into war, shadowed them across oceans, followed them into POW camps, but it could not erase their courage. Then came the most unbelievable moment of all. The Army arranged a private debriefing in Washington. Intelligence officers, analysts, and senior commanders filled a long room. King walked in wearing a clean uniform and sat upright as a stenographer waited with her keys poised. A major set a recorder on the table. "Corporal," he said, "when did you first speak to German guards in their own language?" King told the story, every risk, every word, every heartbeat of terror. When he finished, the room stayed silent. Finally, a colonel leaned forward and said, "Corporal King, by speaking up, you prevented a massacre." King blinked. The weight of those words sank in slowly. He had not just saved himself. He had saved dozens of men, white, black, officers, enlisted. And then, in that same room, King learned something that made his hands tremble. The SS captain who had threatened them was alive, captured, and awaiting trial. King would testify. His German would be used again, this time not to save lives, but to hold a murderer accountable. When King returned to the barracks that evening, Harris greeted him at the door. "So?" he asked. King sat on his bunk, staring at the floor. "I've got to testify," he whispered. Harris nodded slowly, placing a hand on his shoulder. "Then testify. Make sure they never forget what we lived through." For the first time since liberation, King cried, not from fear, but from the realization that history, for once, needed his voice. Months passed, but the memory of barbed wire and frozen mornings never left him. King spent spring recovering, gaining weight, rebuilding strength, relearning the feeling of safety. Yet freedom did not erase what he owed. When the government called him to testify at the War Crimes Tribunal in Nuremberg, he went without hesitation. The thought of standing in the same room as the men who starved and beat his fellow prisoners sent a cold knot into his chest, but the idea of staying silent felt worse. He had survived for a reason. In the courthouse, polished wood replaced frozen dirt, chandeliers replaced prison lights, and judges' robes replaced SS uniforms, but the stakes were the same. Guards led the SS captain into the chamber in shackles. His face was gaunt, but his eyes were still sharp, filled with the same contempt King remembered. When their eyes met, the captain's sneer flickered just for a moment. He recognized the man who had spoken perfect German in the snow, the prisoner who had stood tall when others bowed. King felt no need to speak to him. His testimony would do that. He swore the oath, voice steady, hand raised. Prosecutors asked questions, and King answered in precise German and English, switching effortlessly. He described starvation rations, forced labor, beatings, the sick left without medicine, prisoners executed for attempting escape. And then he told them about the trench, how the captain had ordered men to dig in frozen ground without explanation, how everyone in the camp believed it was a grave. Gasps rippled through the courtroom. Some of the officers on trial shifted in their seats, uncomfortable. Truth had that effect. When he finished, the judge thanked him. King stepped down, legs trembling, not from fear but from release. The weight he had carried since captivity, every bruise, every night of terror had been spoken aloud for the world to hear. He had given voice to the dead and the living. The SS captain was sentenced. Justice, slow and imperfect, still came, but King's story did not end with Nuremberg. He returned home to a country that barely understood what he had endured. Posters showed smiling white soldiers kissing girls in Times Square. Films showed triumphant endings. But King and his fellow black POWs arrived quietly, without parades. Some civilians didn't believe black men had served overseas. Others didn't believe they had flown, fought, or suffered in POW camps. Prejudice that had crumbled in the face of German rifles still lingered in American streets. One afternoon, while boarding a bus outside the base, King was told to move to the back. After surviving Hitler's Germany, it felt surreal. He stared at the empty front seats, then at the driver. "I just fought a war," he said softly. "I don't want another one today." And he moved. Not because he accepted the rules, but because he was too tired to fight that battle alone. Still, the world was changing. Slowly. Newspapers printed stories of the Tuskegee Airmen, of black units in Europe, of the men who had returned from camps like Stalag Luft III. King's testimony circulated through legal journals and military reports. Universities invited him to speak. Some audiences listened politely. Others leaned forward, shocked, realizing for the first time that American soldiers came in every color and bled the same. Years later, King became a teacher. He married a nurse who had volunteered at the field hospital in France. She had brought him soup on his first night of freedom. They raised 2 children who grew up never knowing the sound of guard towers or the feel of frozen bunks. King never glorified the war. When his students asked about it, he told them the truth. Fear, hunger, cruelty, and the quiet acts of courage that saved lives. He stayed in touch with the men from Barracks 13. Every winter, on the anniversary of liberation, they called each other. Some voices weakened over time. Some faded entirely, but King kept a list of names in a small leather notebook. He checked it each year, and each year it grew shorter. That was the price of survival. In his old age, he returned to Europe one last time, standing where the camp had once been. The barracks were gone. Trees grew where prisoners once marched. The air was quiet, too quiet, as if the land itself remembered and chose silence out of respect. King knelt, pressing his hand to the cold earth. "We lived," he whispered. "You didn't break us." When he died at 92, his children found that leather notebook. Inside it were the names of every man from Barracks 13, and a single sentence written beneath them. "We were Americans, even when our country forgot." The government eventually recognized his service. His story became part of military history, taught to cadets who studied the laws of war. And when historians retold what happened in that camp, one detail always stood out. A starving black POW stood in the snow and spoke German to the SS. And the world changed just enough for his men to survive. Not because he was stronger. Not because he was lucky. But because in the darkest moment of his life he refused to be silent.